So David was one of the most written about people in the Bible. We're going to be in 1 Samuel, starting in about 15 and 16 tonight, if you want to be turning there. That's kind of the start of David's life in the Bible. He's mentioned in Ruth, where it talks about Boaz being, I think he's the great-grandfather of David. Let me check real quick. It's at the end of Ruth. Boaz begot Obed. Jesse was born of Obed, and David was born of Jesse. So, yeah, Boaz and Ruth. Ruth was his great-grandmother. So that's the lineage of David. So that's where he's mentioned first. We read about him in 1 and 2 Samuel. We read about him in 1st and 2nd First Chronicles, 1 Kings. A lot of the Psalms were written by him. So David is mentioned quite a bit in the Bible. There's a lot about David. I'm not working, Russ. I don't know what I did, but there we go. We're going to start out with a little bit of history, just some background, so that we kind of have an idea what's going on in history at the time of the nation of Israel. The time of Judges lasts about 300 to 400 years. That's the time that from when Joshua conquered the land, and then when Joshua died, and then there were judges for about 300 to 400 years before Samuel, David, and Saul all came upon the scene. I do want to read Judges chapter 2, 11 through 19, so we can kind of get an idea of what it was like in the nation at that time. Judges 2, 11 through 19. Then the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. And they forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and followed other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them, and bowed themselves down to them. Thus they provoked the Lord to anger. So they forsook the Lord and served Baal and Ashtaroth. The anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he gave them into the hands of plunderers who plundered them, and he sold them into the hands of their enemies around them, so that they could no longer stand before their enemies. And this is going to be key in further along our study where Goliath comes into the picture. So remember these verses here, that the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he gave them into the hands of plunderers who plundered them. And he sold them into the hands of their enemies around them, so that they could no longer stand before their enemies. Wherever they went, the hand of the Lord was against them for evil, as the Lord had spoken, and as the Lord had sworn to them, so that they were severely distressed. Then the Lord raised up judges who delivered them from the hands of those who plundered them. Yet they did not listen to their judges, for they played the harlot after other gods, and bowed themselves down to them. They turned aside quickly from the way in which their fathers had walked in obeying the commandments of the Lord. They did not do as their fathers. When the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judges and delivered them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who oppressed and afflicted them. But it came about when the judge died that they would turn back and act more corruptly than their fathers in following other gods to serve them and bow down to them. They did not abandon their practices or their stubborn ways. And so there was a cycle that the nation of Israel was in, that they would worship and serve other gods, and God would get angry, and he would rise up people around them to plunder them, take their goods, to defeat them, to be their enemies. And they were afflicted, and they would cry out to the Lord, and he would raise up a judge, and the judge would follow what God wanted them to do, and they would turn back to the Lord. The judge would die, and then they would just get back in. It was just a cycle. But it upset God that they would, as he indicated here, played the harlot after other gods. In other words, they were unfaithful to God. And and I want you to remember this because, again, as we go through the life of David, it's going to have an effect on some of the mindset of the Israelites at the time. As we finish up Judges, Eli was the high priest. In the beginning of Samuel, Eli is the high priest. And Samuel was born, if you'd have to read the first part of 1 Samuel to get the story of Hannah and all the things that surrounded Samuel's birth and how faithful Hannah was. But he was born, and Hannah gave him up so that he could serve God, and she gave him to Eli to raise, and raised him in the temple. 1 Samuel chapter 2, we see that Eli's sons did evil in the sight of the Lord. And in 1 Samuel 8, Eli and his sons all died, if I recall right. God took care of Eli's sons because they were doing such evil in his sight. Then Eli died. Samuel became a prophet and a judge. And he was a very faithful man to God. And he appointed his sons judges. But his sons were evil. They took bribes and perverted justice. And the people said, you know what, this is not good. As you're reading this, why would Samuel, who was a godly man, appoint his son judges when he knew that they were that way? And I think part of that is just because they were his sons, his biological sons. It's just a natural thing. Want to do that. The other lesson that I get from Eli and his sons and Samuel and his sons is that the father was very godly, a very godly person. And yet the sons did evil in the sight of the Lord. There wasn't very many people as righteous as Samuel or as godly as Samuel. And yet his sons did evil. And I know it's easy for us as people today to have the mindset that parents sometimes often don't know how to raise their kids because the kids turn out a lot different than the parents were. Parents don't always have control of how the kids turn out. You can't blame the parents. I suppose sometimes we could say they could have done a better job. It's not always the fault of the parents that somebody turns out evil. It sure wasn't the fault of Samuel that his sons turned out evil. But they did. And he appointed them judges, and the nation said, we don't want this. We don't want these guys judging us. Good night. They're taking bribes and everything. We want a king. And so they asked for a king, and that upset Samuel because he knew that wasn't what God had in mind. But God said, listen to him, appoint a king. Yeah, I could do that. Sorry, I forgot to do that. Gee, I thought he was going to ask a question, Russ. I was ready to answer a question. You got any questions back there, Russ? Okay. So a little more background history. After Saul's death, Saul was the first king that was appointed by God. After Saul's death, David was made king over Judah, and 7 years later, he was made king over all Israel. He was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned from about 1009 BC to 969 BC. Solomon, his son, became king in 971 BC. And if you read in the Bible, it talks about how they knew David was dying, and one of his sons was trying to take the throne, but God had said Solomon was going to be king. And so David had Solomon crowned king while he was still alive. And a couple years later, David died. And Solomon reigned until 931 BC. That's just a little history. Samuel warns the people about having a king. If you have a king, he's going to want your daughters. He's going to want a tithe from you. He's going to want your camels, the best of your land, the best of your vineyards. That we know. We still want a king. We want to be like all the other nations. Saul was the first king. In the first part of 1 Samuel, we see how Saul became king and some of the story surrounds Saul. We won't spend a lot of time on that because we're going to focus on David, but this is some of the background. Saul came from a wealthy family. It says that there wasn't a man more handsome than Saul. From his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the people. He is a kingly kind of guy, right? He comes from a rich background, you know. His family's probably well known in the country if they're rich. Nobody is more handsome than him. You ever see the People magazine? Always has the sexiest man of the year once a year. I know that because I delivered mail and I would see it on the cover of People magazine. So every year they would have like the sexiest man. And so that was an attribute to this person, that he's something pretty attractive to the world, right? And these would be things that people would look for, right? Now God's the one who appointed Saul. But these are the things that people look for in a leader. Man, if you're going to pick a leader, you want somebody that's got wisdom, intelligent, strong, athletic, good looking, and comes from wealth. You know, it's kind of funny when we do presidential elections. Sometimes commentators will say that this guy doesn't have that look that people are looking for. You know, he might be bald and fat like me. Well, I'm not bald, I'm just fat. You know, may not personally be appealing to the people by what he looks like. He might make the best president we've ever had. But people have already made a decision about him because of his appearance, or maybe because of his background, or, you know, oftentimes one party really looks at your blue-collar black background, you know. Hey, my dad was a milkman, you know. I grew up I wasn't one of these silver spoon kind of guys. But ultimately, Saul disobeyed God. A couple of instances, one where God says, I want you to completely destroy this nation of people, men, women, children, animals, everything. Destroy everything. And Saul gets in there and he saves some of the people, and he looks at the sheep and goes, man, I could have these sheep in my herd. You know, and he saves the animal. And Samuel challenges him about that. No, I did what God said. Well, how come I hear a bunch of sheep bleating? Samuel would say. Well, the soldiers, you know, they saw that some of the stuff was good, so they kept it, you know. Even though I'm king, I'm in charge, he wants to blame the soldiers. That was one time. Another time, he sacrificed to God. He didn't wait for Samuel to come. He was supposed to wait for Samuel to come to make a sacrifice before they went to battle, and he got itchy feet, and he went ahead and sacrificed and went to battle. He didn't wait for Samuel. And God says, you know what? I've had enough of this guy. Then the word of the Lord came to Samuel, saying, I regret that I have made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me and has not carried out my commands. And Samuel was distressed and cried out to the Lord all night. It broke Samuel's heart that the leader of the nation of Israel would turn his back on God. So, 1 Samuel 16, 1 through 13. We'll read that real quick. And these are, again, this is just a context of a lot of the lessons that I'm going to be bringing about David, so you have this understanding about the events that are happening, where the nation is as a people. And so a lot of lessons will be built off this. So 1 Samuel chapter 16, 1 through 13. Now the Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have selected a king for myself among his sons." But Samuel said, "How can I go? When Saul hears of it, he will kill me." And the Lord said, "Take a heifer with you and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. You shall invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what you shall do. And you shall anoint for me the one whom I designate to you." So Samuel did what the Lord said and came to Bethlehem. And the elders of the city came trembling to meet him and said, "Do you come in peace?" He said, "In peace. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice." He also consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. Then it came about when they entered that he looked at Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed is before him." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look at his appearance or at the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For God sees not as a man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." Then Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel, and he said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." Next Jesse made Shammah pass by, and he said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." Thus Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. But Samuel said to Jesse, "The Lord has not chosen these." And Samuel said to Jesse, "Are these all the children?" And he said, "There remains yet the youngest, and behold, he is tending the sheep." Then Samuel said to Jesse, "Send and bring him, for we will not sit down until he comes here." So he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy, with beautiful eyes, and a handsome appearance. And the Lord said, "Arise, anoint him, for this is he." And Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. And Samuel arose and went to Ramah. We see in verses 6 and 7. When they entered, he looked at Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed is before him." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look at his appearance or at the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For God sees not as a man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." And we see a reference in Acts 13:22. After he removed Saul from being king, he raised up David to be their king, concerning whom he also testified, said, "I have found David, the son of Jesse, a man after my heart, who will do all my will." So the reference there is David is a man after God's own heart. And what does that mean? And how do we look at people? Put yourself in Samuel's shoes, okay? And as maybe the world would decide who's going to be king. First of all, here comes Eliab. He's the oldest, right? Probably shows some responsibility. He had 7 other brothers. If you've been in a large family, anybody in here come from a large family? Jay, how many brothers and sisters did you have?
5 brothers.
Are you the oldest?
No, I'm in the middle.
You're in the middle. Who's your oldest? Is it the sister or one of the brothers?
Brother.
And what's his name?
Wendell.
Wendell? Did Wendell have some responsibility helping raise some of you guys, or did the parents seem to put more responsibility on Wendell than maybe the rest of the kids? Because he's the oldest? Yeah. What do you want to say, Noah?
I come from a large family.
You do? How many brothers and sisters do you have?
I have 3 brothers and 3 sisters.
Okay. But you're in a unique situation where you're not around them all the time and have the ability to take care of them, right? So, yes, you do. How many brothers and sisters do you have, Brandon?
The whole world.
Good one.
You got us there.
We got the reference there. We got a lot of brothers and sisters in Christ. Good job. But the world looks, here's the oldest. He's the oldest. Now, we don't know how old Eliab is, but oftentimes the oldest has showed more responsibility because they are the oldest. And for whatever reason, Samuel even said, well, surely this guy's it. Maybe he seemed to have responsible. Samuel thought Eliab was the one. 7 sons passed before Samuel. David had not even been included in this. Jesse didn't even think that it was important enough. Samuel was a well-known prophet. Everybody knew who Samuel was. And yet, David had the responsibility of taking care of his father's sheep. And that's where he was at. He wasn't even in this special event. Right there shows a little bit about David's heart, his character, who he is. It talks about how he was ruddy. And if I remember right, ruddy means kind of a red skin type of tint to his skin. Beautiful eyes and handsome. That just is one of the traits with David's, is that they're handsome. Yeah, okay. Not even a smile. You realize my name's David, right? How you doing, Scott? Good to see you, brother. And he was young. Normally we don't think of young people as being leaders, right? I mean, we're talking about the next king here. And here's the youngest of 7 brothers who's out watching sheep because that's his job, which wasn't a very, that job didn't carry a lot of prestige with it, okay? It wasn't like they were fighting over who could go watch the sheep. It was, you know what, I'm not going to watch the sheep. Let's get David to go do it because he's the youngest. So in man's eyes, the qualifications that David had at this time didn't seem to measure up. But God says he has a heart like mine. He has a heart after mine. Let's read 1 Samuel 16, 14 through 23. Now the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord terrorized him. Saul's servants then said to him, Behold, now an evil spirit from God is terrorizing you. Let our Lord now command your servants who are before you, let them seek a man who is a skillful player on the harp. And it shall come about when the evil spirit from God is on you, that he shall play the harp with his hand, and you will be well. So Saul said to his servants, Provide for me now a man who can play well, and bring him to me. Then one of the young men answered and said, Behold, I have seen a son of Jesse, the Bethlehemite, who is a skillful musician, a mighty man of valor, a warrior, one prudent in speech, and a handsome man, and the Lord is with him. So Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, Send me your son David, who is with the flock. Jesse took a donkey loaded with bread and a jug of wine and a young goat, and sent them to Saul by David his son. Then David came to Saul and attended him, and Saul loved him greatly, and he became his armor-bearer. Saul sent to Jesse, saying, Let David now stand before me, for he has found favor in my sight. So it came about whenever the evil spirit from God came to Saul, David would take the harp and play it with his hand, and Saul would be refreshed and be well, and the evil spirit would depart from him. God had removed his spirit from Saul, and we saw that God had placed his spirit into David. David could play the lyre and sing. Here is an ability for a young person. He's already developed the skill to sing and play a lyre. It says that David was a man of valor, war, prudent in speech, good presence, and that the Lord was with him. And we see that through God's providence, he put David in the presence of Saul. There's a reason that David is playing for Saul. There's a connection there. And we see in the next chapter, in chapter 17, another connection when David goes to the battlefield and faces Goliath. But already, David is in Saul's presence. All right. Here are some of the things that I want us to take away from tonight. Appearance doesn't indicate where the heart is. We can't judge somebody by their appearance, their background, their wealth, their income, where they were born, their ethnicity. We can't judge people. We don't know where their heart is. And this is an important part that I really want I want to bring this point home. The young can have a heart for God. You don't have to be a 60-year-old elder to have a heart for God, right? Most scholars say David was a teenager. They put him somewhere between 13 and 16 years old at the time that this was happening. And yet he already had a heart for God. So I'm talking to you young people tonight, for sure, that you can have a heart for God. You can. Yeah. And I'm really proud of you, Noah, because the last few times we got together, you've done some things that just really impressed me. That's one of them, and we're still working on that, brother. The one I'm thinking about is when you allowed other people to go before you in the food line, and you got up and gave me my chair. You did. Huh? It was comfy. But that shows me that you have a heart for other people. And that's the kind of heart that God wants us to have. And I'm just telling you, young people, you don't have to be 50 years old to have a heart for God. David was 16 years old. We'll just give him the high end of that. 16 years old. And he had a heart for God. God chose him over all the other brothers of Jesse. God can use you for his purpose if you allow it. God can use you for his purpose if you allow it. See, here's the story of David. David's job was to take care of some sheep. He's out there taking care of some sheep, and somebody says, Dad wants you at the house. Samuel's up here, and for whatever reason, Samuel asked for you. Oh, okay, so he obeys. He goes to the house. Samuel anoints him. He's going to become king. Did David have any idea? Did David have any idea that he was going to become king someday? He didn't have any idea. As far as he knew, he might have been a sheep herder all his life. That was his plan. I'm going to take care of these sheep for Dad, and you know what? Someday I'm going to have a herd of my own. I'm going to have 8 sons, and I'm going to have somebody shepherd my sheep, and I'm going to find some good-looking gal, and we're going to settle down. Isn't that what 16-year-olds think about? I'm not 16. 21-year-olds think of that, okay. 16-year-olds think about video games, right? Okay, Dave didn't have video games. He wasn't sitting around. Yes, Brandon. You think about work, okay? And so one day somebody taps you on the shoulder and says, you're going to be president of the United States within a few years here. Yeah, it's not on your agenda, is it? It wasn't on David's agenda either, okay? And that's the point I'm getting. But God wanted him to be king. Yes, Noah? That's probably right. My job is to take care of the sheep. We'll see a little later that he talks about that. You know, when he goes up against Goliath, he talks about that. I don't have sheep. Okay. Help me get through this, okay, Noah? It's hard for me to make a emphatic. Do you know what emphatic means? Okay, it means making a point and really punching it home. It's hard for me to do that when sometimes you interrupt me, okay? I don't mind questions, but it's hard for me to make an emphatic point. I don't think David was sitting around saying, I'm going to be king. But God chose him to be king. And as we read along, David does become king. David's life is going to change dramatically. We're going to see some things in his life. He had a difficult life. King Saul spent the rest of his life trying to kill him. You want somebody stalking you, trying to kill you the rest of your life because God chose you to be a king someday? I'm thinking I just want to hang out with the sheep, right? But see, David had a heart after God. God says, I'm calling you to do this. And David said, okay. If that's what you want me to do, God, that's what I'm going to do. Nathan Goodman was sitting in a jail about 10 years ago, saying to himself, I'm sure, someday I'm going to be a minister at Cedarloo Church of Christ. Do you think, seriously, do you think that even crossed his mind? I think you're right, Brandon. I don't think it did. But God has a purpose for Nathan. And guess what he's going to be doing in January? He's going to be moving up here and becoming a minister for us. I, at 16, was never thinking about being an elder of the church. I'm telling you, that never even crossed my mind. Not even once. I was a 16-year-old. I was thinking about fast cars. No, not fast women. Fast cars. Right? Yeah. My first car was a 71 Monte Carlo. That thing would chirp the tires every time I wanted it to. Okay, I'm getting off subject here. But that's what 16-year-olds think about, right? And I don't want to... Now I'm an elder of the Cedarloo Church of Christ, okay? God saw something for me to do, and I accepted God's path for me. I'm telling you, it'd be easy to say no, because there's a lot of challenges to being an elder. It'd be easy to say no. But I also realize that God designed the church, and part of that design is that there are elders that need to shepherd the church. If nobody wants to shepherd the church, there is no church. That's how that's going to work. And the church is important enough to me to do that. David allowed God to use him for his purpose. And we should do the same. And it's most often going to come at sacrifice to self. Most often, when God has a purpose for you, you have to die to self first and do his will, not yours. So the two things I want for us to get tonight, if nothing else, young people, you can have a heart for God. God has a purpose for you. Find it. And then do it. You don't have to wait till you're 50 years old to say, okay, I've lived my life. I guess now it's time to do something for God. God has a purpose for you guys right now. Okay? Find it. But it's going to come at a sacrifice to self. We're going to see all the things that David had to sacrifice because God wanted him to be king. And those lessons are coming on down the line. Any questions or feedback? All right. Next Wednesday night, you might want to read 1 Samuel chapter 17. It's a fairly familiar story. It's the one about David and Goliath. We're not going to get through all of chapter 17. There's some things I want to bring out before we get to the actual battle. But that's where we're going to be at next Wednesday night. Thank you for your questions and your attention.